I don't know about y'all, but I could do with a little rewind, a little look back, a little nostalgia right about now. And I can always go for some quality time with beautiful art. So it's a good thing the Other Art Fair is back in Chicago, April 9th through the 12th. This year's theme is Nostalgia Core. So you can find a curated selection of interactive artist-led projects that celebrate those memories that make us, a little misty-eyed. Support 115 plus independent artists and meet them in person at Artifact events in Ravenswood. Tickets start at just $20. Book them now at theotherartfair.com. Today on CityCast Chicago, ICE is at O'Hare, a city council stalemate, and how is Chicago faring in its eternal battle against the rats? It's Wednesday, March 25th. I'm Jacoby Cochran, and this is what Chicago's talking about. We've got executive producer Simone Alisea back in the building. Oh, you're not bored of me just yet, are you?
Never, Jacoby. It's been 5 years.
Hey, I appreciate you making time. Earlier this week, we talked about how spring break was likely to impact Midway and O'Hare, but we recorded that conversation before the federal government announced that it was sending ICE agents, Department of Homeland Security agents, to at least 13 airports across the country, including Chicago's O'Hare. Simone, now that they've actually been deployed, what's the purpose of this?
Yeah, so that also kind of depends on who you ask. Ostensibly, the concept here, as we had talked about, right, on Monday, is the federal government is in the midst of a partial shutdown, right? And over this debate, specifically over Department of Homeland Security funding. Now, what's interesting is both TSA, right, the security at airports, and ICE are under the Department of Homeland Security. However, because of the way funding works and this sort of tranche of funding from Trump's big tax cut bill, right, ICE agents and that agency has funding and those agents are getting paid, but TSA agents are currently working without pay during this partial shutdown.
50,000, at least 50,000 TSA employees haven't been paid since February 14th and are expected to miss another paycheck later this week if, right, some funding package isn't passed.
Assuming no deal's met, right? And the shutdown has come about because Democrats, are saying we're not going to give more funding to ICE. We'll fund the rest of DHS, but we're not going to fund ICE. We need to do something about ICE. And of course, the Republicans and the Trump administration's like, no, that's not going to happen. And so that's where the stalemate comes from. But TSA agents have been working without pay. And so, TSA agents, as can be expected, and as we saw during the last government shutdown, there's been a higher rate of call outs, right? People calling in sick, and also just people who are really considering, like, is this really the job for me? I mean, the base pay for TSA agents, I think, is like $34,000. I don't know that a lot of people are really excited about seeing their TSA agents in an airport. So I think there's probably a lot of motivation there. And so generally, this is leading to delays at airports, right? Not enough people staffing security, getting people through. And so the idea, theoretically, is the Trump administration is like, okay, we're going to deploy ICE agents to help, quote unquote, alleviate some of these delays. However, they don't actually have the training to kind of like do what TSA agents actually do. Like, they're not like looking at scans and x-rays or whatever and like moving people through. They're like, oh, maybe we can help with security, but like there's no real guidance for what that looks like.
I read that they were, from your point, just sort of standing at initial check-in. Some people are just lording behind the TSA agents who are checking IDs. Some are working in the bins. It's just, it feels like they've just been dumped on the TSA agents who are there and are like, give them something to do.
Pretty much. And I mean, the union for the TSA agents is like, hey, we think this is a bad idea. On Monday, there, a bunch of reporters went out to O'Hare after reports that ICE agents had been spotted and saw ICE agents literally just standing around, trying to avoid cameras, not doing anything. Not dissimilar from what we have seen from National Guard deployments. Now, I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is so yes, ostensibly, it's like, oh, we're going to take these paid ICE agents to help these continually unpaid TSA agents. But also at the same time, you have Trump, who is like, well, we got to get the SAVE Act passed, which is the voting disenfranchisement bill that he's been pushing. And so this is deeply, deeply political at its core, as is everything that the Trump administration does, as is everything Trump does with ICE specifically as an agency.
I was just going to say deeply unorganized and likely to fly right back in their face, because at least for an onlooker like me, it re-highlights a few things. One, there was no real plan for what to do with these massive new hirings that they pay for in ICE. Two, it speaks to just how we've already had complaints about their lack of training and the job they were supposedly hired to do.
Right. The job of enforcing immigration law. Right.
So using them in airports already speaks to them being out of position. It speaks to how unorganized we are in their deployment, how little plan we have for this rapid expansion. And again, I think it speaks to how personal the Trump administration sees ICE as a force. The fact that they are meant to be deployed cavalierly across California, then Chicago, then the Twin Cities. Now y'all going to be in airports. Wherever I tell you to go and whatever I tell you to do, you are going to do it. And then on top of that, I read a report that 30% of TSA agents at Midway had called off about a week ago. The numbers across the country may be at around 10 to 12%, but you've had some 400 agents quit. I think putting untrained forces who are notoriously violent in all instances across the country, putting them right next to people who are underpaid and not getting paid at the moment as their part of the agency is being flushed with cash, I think is only going to sour more people to TSA and get more people to call off, to walk off their job. That doesn't even consider the fact that it's terrifying for everyone involved for them to be there.
That's the thing about this that I think, so there's sort of this political cat and mouse game vis-a-vis DHS funding that's going on, right? But I think the other thing, and it's worth noting so far, no ICE agents seen at Midway, just at O'Hare. I think the expectation is that some 75 agents will be deployed at O'Hare over the next at least week or so. We don't really know how long this partial shutdown will last even. But I think this is the other thing that people who were at Midway this week have observed, which is just for those of us who lived through Operation Midway Blitz and who lived through the tear gas in our streets and sort of people getting taken off the streets, right? The idea that these agents are now, the idea that these agents are now just hanging out in O'Hare, that's the other thing, this idea that they're there to do just sort of the general helping, quote unquote, but also they've sort of said well, we will do an enforcement action if the situation comes up. Right.
We are going to racially profile people.
And so I think, in the Tribune, there was a person who sort of talked about it is fully within the pattern of intimidation tactics that the Trump administration has employed. And I think it's kind of a lose-lose situation because, as I said, the sort of funding issue here is about ICE, is about this agency, right? And Democrats who are trying to sort of stake a claim and be no, we're not going to fund this agency, but this agency already has a bunch of funding that they can kind of rely on that these TSA agents can't, right? That's why they're not getting paid. And to your point, ICE has really kind of just become the president's own personal goon squad that he can just deploy wherever he thinks there's a problem or wherever he wants to show that he can do whatever he wants. And until such point that we have a president who doesn't do that, it creates, either way, it's going to kind of create issues regardless of whatever stand Democrats are making on the budget.
Imagine I ain't been paid in 6 weeks and I look over at this mass loser standing next to me who is still cashing their paycheck, who has no understanding of my job, their job, and whose physical presence represents an act of intimidation and cruelty. I can't imagine how pissed off these TSA workers are, many of which the ones who have arrived are working in good faith. Like the hope that they will get their back pay and their paycheck. I can't imagine being put in that position.
You know, it's also interesting to me because I think airports have long been a site for Trump to enact chaos. I think back to his first term, right, and the travel ban and the way that was sort of enacted, and you had these massive crowds and confusion of people who didn't know if they could leave or come, or if their family could come meet them, or you know what I mean? Like the airports have long kind of been a site for Trump to put his foot down, to stamp his feet, whatever the case might be. The Trib had an interesting story about like how to help TSA workers who, you know, because they are unpaid. And it's worth noting that like there are rules around federal employees accepting gifts and certainly soliciting gifts as well. But the American Federation of Government Employees, the union, has said that grocery store or gas station gift cards, and they should be low value gift cards, can be mailed to them, and that the locals can then kind of distribute those to workers who may be struggling because they're not being paid during the shutdown.
Good to know. We will definitely drop links in our show notes. Access Contemporary Music's Sound of Silent Film Festival is now in its 21st year. And I already know what you're thinking. Kobe, this an audio medium, and that sound a bit like an oxymoron. Doesn't a silent film festival just sound like this? But here's the thing. This festival features newly composed musical scores performed live, so it's movies and a concert. These silent films were selected from more than 100 submissions to an international call, and they span comedy, drama, experimental, and beyond. Plus, they short. Each one is only about 2 to 15 minutes long. And to top it all off, the festival is at none other than the Music Box Theater, one of my favorite spots in the city and a beautiful setting for this kind of event. The Sound of Silent Film Festival is happening Wednesday, April 8th at 7:30 p.m. Tickets are available at acmusic.org.
Hi, CityCast listeners. This is David Plotz. I'm the CEO of CityCast, but I also have another job. I'm one of the hosts of the Political Gabfest, Slate's politics podcast. Every week, I get on mic with my co-hosts Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson, and we talk about politics and a lot more about other things that we care about. The Gabfest has been going for more than 20 years because the three of us love talking to each other, and we have an amazing community of listeners. If you like the open-hearted, curious way CityCast approaches cities, I think you'll like the Political Gabfest too. Stream it on YouTube or wherever you get your podcast.
Simone, we have covered pretty closely ongoing tension between the city council and the mayor's office. There was some discord around the budget, with city council ultimately passing their own version of a budget. We've seen the mayor have to rely on vetoes against ordinances passed in the city council, including a snap teen curfew, the hemp ban, as well as most recently the sub-minimum wage, with city council voting to pause. But another point of tension is about an ongoing vacancy in the zoning committee. The former chair of the zoning committee was longtime alderperson Walter Burnett, but Simone, he retired last summer. And it seems that we still haven't named a permanent replacement in the city council. And that's led to a bit of a face-off once again between the mayor and his allies and some of the current alder people, including Bennett Lawson, who is currently serving as interim chair. This
story is a bit of inside baseball, I will say. You know, we're talking about committee chair appointments, which is a deeply political process in Chicago. It's interesting because like I was looking up sort of like what are the actual rules around committee appointments, and sort of like the way it's written is city council is supposed to sort of approve the chairs of those committees. Committees are established by resolution, but historically, you know, it has kind of been a way for the mayor to enact power over city council. It's sort of the mayor's choices of chair, and it's not even necessarily like a kind of formal appointment process. It's just kind of a thing that happens in the course of business. And so, you know, the zoning committee is one of the most powerful committees in city council, because when we talk zoning, that is basically how we decide what gets built in the city. How tall is the building? What kinds of businesses? What kinds of storefronts? What kinds of homes? Right.
It's also typically where you see some of the most political maneuvering. Alders get a lot of say on what's built in their ward, but those things still have to go through the zoning committee, have to go through the full chair. And that's where you see a lot of collaboration, a lot of back scratching,
wheeling and dealing. Yeah, for sure. On that front, it's like, you know, the chair of that committee can say, well, Jacoby, I know you want to get this project built in your ward, but we have this other ordinance on such and such thing. And like, you know, that's, you know, we got to figure out how we're going to get that passed, or whatever the case might be, right? So it's a really powerful committee. You know, I think second only to finance, right? In terms of historically how it's kind of operated. And to your point, it has been the committee that has entrenched that aldermanic prerogative of where aldermen kind of get to decide. This is what goes on in my ward. And because, again, zoning is really that thing, and choices over what gets built is really that thing that alders have quite a lot of say over in their ward. And so the fact that we've been without a permanent chair for many, many months now is very unusual.
I spoke earlier and said Lawson was the interim chair, but in fact, he's the vice chair.
But he's kind of the as such, he's the acting chair and has been since Burnett retired. It's also worth noting that like Burnett was in there, you know, initially it was alderperson Carlos Ramirez Rosa. You know, he came under some fire a while back for sort of a physical altercation. With another alder. He eventually, of course, he's now the head of parks. Burnett was put into the role. But then, of course, Burnett retired. Lawson kind of has ascended into this acting role. And, you know, at the end of the year, he gave Brandon Johnson an ultimatum and was like, you know, make me permanent or endorse me as the permanent chair, or no business is going to get done. And
which at the
January,
which at the time I was like, okay. I'm sure there's a lot of parliamentary moves here. I'm sure they will find a way to keep it. I didn't realize that the chair basically got to determine if the meetings ever even happen.
Yeah.
I guess I completely missed that in City Council 101.
The committees are sort of a thing that are self-governed, so to speak, by city council. It's not like a thing that says in the municipal code, like, oh, you need to have a committee on XYZ and it has to meet this many times. Like that's not really set out anywhere. It's just it's set out by resolution, which, you know, is not the most binding thing. And, you know, there are certainly public meetings rules that they have to abide by. So, for example, in January, there was no zoning committee meeting, right? In February, there was one that actually had some pretty big business. You know, there was that new, like, what used to be Lincoln Yards now is Foundry Park. You know, that was talked about. But, you know, Lawson has said, you know, that he's putting something on the calendar for April to comply with, you know, public notice laws, that you have to give public notice of a meeting. But like, if this doesn't get solved, he's planning to not have a meeting. And now you have the Chicagoland Chamber of Commerce getting involved, being like, the sort of failure to agree on a head here is stalling, you know, some 40 or so development projects that, you know, are very important to them. And, you know, I think are probably important to a lot of people. You know, for his part, Johnson's office at this point is sort of saying like, again, because historically these chairs are sort of thought of as mayoral appointments. I was looking up because I was trying to figure this out a little bit as to what degree this was like officially an appointment or not. And there was like a press release from Mayor Rahm Emanuel that just announced, here's who the new chairs are, and like didn't go into the process. He's like, these are the new chairs. It'll be passed in the next city council meeting. And like, that's it. That was the press release. Meanwhile, you have Johnson's office now kind of saying like, oh, well, it's like the city council's had multiple chances to vote. They could vote on choosing Lawson, and they're choosing not to. It seems like there's some issues with the Black Caucus in city council who, basically they're looking for sort of some maneuvering where Alderman Gilbert Villegas would take over for zoning committee so that Alderman David Moore could replace Villegas in his committee appointment.
Economic development chair.
Yeah. And so like, there's sort of a pushback here, but, it's interesting because to me, the idea that the mayor's office is like, well, that's the city council's job is kind of wild to me because, again, historically, not how we have approached chair appointments for a very long time in Chicago. Certainly not under Emanuel, certainly not under the Dailies. I think Lightfoot probably had some issues in this regard, but this is a really long time to not have a permanent chair.
It's so interesting going from personnel story to personnel because you read the Chicago Housing Authority named their new CEO, and that went against the mayor's wishes, but it was within their power to clearly name their own leader. And now, but in this case, where Lawson is saying, well, we're going by precedent. You name, you endorse, we take vote. The mayor's like, no, you got the power. Do it on your own. The way personnel issues and the context around them have changed from department to department, from agency to agency, city council to it's really interesting because the justification leaves me very confused on.
I think it speaks
if the mayor's office has a good handling on who they want in leadership positions.
This, to me, more than anything, Johnson gets a lot of criticism for stuff that I don't necessarily know is fair. Like, there's a lot of stuff that gets thrown around. This, to me, is a deep, deep weakness of this administration that is sort of undeniable. I am someone who tends to think like both on appointments that like he really does have kind of a direct hand in, whether that is department appointments that are seeing a lot of pushback or sister agencies where he is sort of making appointments that are being voted on or making, recommendations that are being voted on. This council thing is an interesting one because, again, I do think it's sort of more of a norm rather than a policy. But I do think it is sort of part of a pattern of failing to get buy-in on the people that he thinks should be leading these agencies. And whether the people he thinks are sort of right or not, like, we can debate his selections every which way on sort of like, should they or shouldn't they be. But the fact that it takes so long to get to a point of vote, like I'm even thinking about Chicago Animal Care and Control, right? She was in Susan Capello, right? An acting president for 3 years.
3 years.
Johnson has been in office since May 2023. Like, there is the length of time it takes, the fact that there is so much debate around it. And I think, on the one hand, you could argue like, well, that's very democratic. Like, the fact that everyone kind of gets to have their say and the fact that you do have sort of agencies or even a city council kind of going their own way, like I think can be something that is positive. But the fact that you just have this pattern, again, to me, it shows a pattern of weakness here that I think is much more unavoidable and I think is much more plain than some of the other criticisms that have been levied against the Johnson administration.
To your point, the inconsistency in narrative around personnel, we all understand there's a revolving door here. We expect a lot of people to be hired and fired across an administration. And especially when Mayor Johnson first got into office, right? When he came in, fired Allison Arwoody, head of public health, we were like, oh, this is going to be an administration that moves quick to bring in people that Johnson sees fit to lead these agencies, to be chairs in city council, even within his own administration, thinking about deputy mayors. But what we've seen beyond the turnover is the sense of confusion that there's been a start-stop process in CPS, that we don't have many updates when it comes to CTA, that CHA had to go their own way, that there are stalemates inside of city council, that there have been recent firings inside of City Hall. To your point, I agree. I think we understand all of these jobs are difficult to hire for, but there are too many competing narratives, too many public mistakes that feel like they don't have a handle over the sort of varying process. And it seems like they've been overwhelmed and on the back foot for a few years now.
Well, and now we have another election coming up next year. So like, it's not like he has a bunch of time to get it together.
For most of the 5 years we have been doing this, Chicago has had the designation as the rattiest city in America. Now, there's to be some nuance on this conversation, because most of what that meant was Chicagoans' call about rats more than any other city. We have recently been replaced with that moniker, but we are still closely tracking the various efforts the city takes up to manage Chicago's rat population. And the last time we had this conversation, they were looking into birth control, rat birth control, and how can that be an effective and slightly more humane management technique. And Simone, it looks like we got some of our first data back.
Yeah, so there's a pilot program that a company has been running in Wicker Park, Bucktown area that kicked off last year.
Just about last April.
Yeah.
Yes, and last April, May.
And they were deploying rat birth control pellets. And they also placed some sensors in certain parts of that pilot area to sort of track rodent activity. And they have reported that between August and January, the company recorded an 88% reduction in the density of tracks on the sensors, which implies fewer rats running around. So it seems to be pretty successful. It's interesting because this isn't actually the first time Chicago has tried rat birth control. They had tried it in the past, but it was a liquid birth control that was like difficult to deploy and control. And the pellets are a bit easier. But I think to maybe, I guess, celebrate this victory over the rats, this small battle won in the ongoing war on rats that Chicago has been engaged in since the 1970s, the 60s. I've got a little ratty quiz for you, Jacoby. You want to?
Sure. I did not plan for this.
This is also a quiz you can take along with us. It's on our site, chicago.citycast.fm. And so if you want to play along, I'm not going to ask all the questions in the quiz, but some of my favorites. And Jacoby, I am wondering if you can tell me if you know what species of rat dominates Chicago.
Oh.
I can give you some multiple choice if that's helpful.
Please do.
If that's helpful. Yeah. So the choices I have here are pack rats, bar rats, Norway rats, Canadian cotton rats.
I'm going to go Canadian cotton or Norway. So I'm going to go Canadian cotton.
I'm sorry. It's Norway rats. Ironically, do you know where Norway rats are from originally?
Please tell me. Inform me.
Asia. They're not from Norway. Apparently, back in like the 1700s or whatever, somebody was like, "Oh, it probably came from ships from Norway," and I don't know, it kind of stuck, and so they became stuck. Norway rats. Yeah, and like that's like it's in their like Latin name too. They're Norway rats.
Okay, good to know.
And these are the rats that are pretty much in every city. It's not just Chicago, but like pretty much everywhere in North America and Europe. When you see a rat, you're seeing a Norway rat.
Got it.
So we've talked about rat birth control as a method of controlling the rat population. I'm going to give you a list, and I want you to tell me which of them is not a method that Chicago has tried to use.
Okay, cool.
To curb the rat population. So which one does not belong? Putting a bounty on rats' heads.
That's crazy.
Feral cats. dry ice, or AI Terminator robot rats?
Man, I was like, bounty on their head felt like the winner for a while. And then you got to that last one, and I was like, but that feels too obvious. I'm going to go with the Terminator rats.
That is correct so far. I'm sure it's coming. Cool. I'm sure it's coming.
All right, bet. I was like, I'm going to just trust that I didn't miss that story.
No, I'm sure the robot Terminator rats are coming for us, or, you know, it's going to be with the like delivery robots, and it's going to be like a 2-for-1 and they'll do both. I don't know. I'm sure it's coming for us. But no, we have tried in the past under Mayor Rahm Emanuel. We tried dry ice, and basically, and they've also tried another kind of similar thing of liquid carbon dioxide. But basically, the premise is you put dry ice in like rat burrows, and then it, you know, all the oxygen comes out, and it's all carbon dioxide, and it suffocates, you know, poisons the rats that way.
We've talked to the Razar. That sounds completely up the alley.
Yeah, and the idea is it's a little bit better in the sense that, like, right now, one of the issues with poisoning rats is it hurts other wildlife, particularly raptors and stuff who prey on rats. And so this is a way to kill them without hurting other animals. But the dry ice specifically was halted by the EPA back in the day because it was sort of unapproved. Cities kind of went rogue trying this out and weren't sure like other effects that it could have on the surrounding environment. You know, Chicago famously has kept feral cat colonies in an attempt to curb the rat population. I think that's had pretty mixed levels of success, especially because it's combined with poison. And so then the cats are like, well, I don't want to eat the poison. And so you run into some of the same issues. Back in the 70s, there was an alderman who put a bounty on rats, who said, so this was
was you supposed
alderman
to bring a bag with like all of their bodies in it? Was you supposed to decapitate
you got
them?
$1. You got $1 for every rat killed, and you brought them to the alder's office. This is in what was the 22nd ward.
Oh my God.
And he's at the time, so the New York Times reported on this at the time, and then at the time, bounties had been paid for more than 550 rats. One family had killed more than 40 rats in their backyard. And so I think they had deployed traps, and then you would bring the trap with the killed
with the rat body.
Rat. Yeah.
And then somebody in the alder's office had to like pour it out like a Knight of the Seven Kingdoms and go through it. And
I can only imagine such. The New York Times story does not get into that much detail, but yeah, that was a real thing that Chicagoans had for a while. Was you could get some money for killing the rats.
It was going outside and bonking rats on the head with a baseball bat and throwing them in your satchel. That's nuts.
Last question, Jacoby. As you mentioned, it was for a decade. Chicago was the rattiest city in America, according to
14 to 24.
According to pest control company Orkin, in 2025, which city usurped our title, relegating us once again to second city?
I know a lot of people assuming it's probably New York City reclaiming what we all assumed was just the rattiest city in America, given how much we all associate rats and
so
pizza
much rat content out of New York.
Like, come on, I think about Pizza Rat at least once a month. But it was actually L.A. Los Angeles took home the mantle this year. Couldn't win a Super Bowl, but are the super rattiest city. And
they they took the place of second most populous city from us, and now they've taken. The rats, I suppose, have also moved over. They've moved west to go for the sun.
We're going to hawk them down eventually. We're going to hawk them down. Y'all can keep the rats. We want the movies. We'll take Stuart Little. Any other questions, Simone? Any other facts?
No. So that was just a little taste of the rat quiz we've got. Like I said, you can take the whole quiz at chicago.citycast.fm. I'm
just appreciative that we are talking about a slightly less cruel way to manage Chicago's rat population, because for most of our time having this conversation, and then obviously, as you just provided in some of those clues, all the way going back to Rat Bounty Gate, the city has tried its hands at quite a few techniques, and I'm glad there is at least some positive outlook thus far, a year in. I want to give a huge thank you to our executive producer, Simone Alisea. Seriously, it's been a ball, man. We've talked more on the podcast in the last 3 months than I feel like we had in years combined.
Thanks, Jacoby. It's a good time.
Before we get out of here, make sure you bookmark our website, chicago.citycast.fm. There you are going to find access to our events calendar. You can subscribe to our daily newsletter. And if you really love the work that we're doing, consider becoming a CityCast Chicago neighbor. You'll get ad-free listening, access to neighbors-only events. You can do that at membership.citycast.fm. Of course, we can't get out of here without some good news. Before the No Kings protest returns to Grant Park this Saturday, you can meet up with fellow Chicagoans to make protest signs and buttons. Thanks to Hey, I Thought of You out in Irving Park. The event is free, and I will drop a link in our show notes. We are going to be back bright and early tomorrow. We'll talk to you then. Peace.